The Supreme Court has wrapped up one of its most consequential terms in decades, leaving the president with even more power and putting Congress in what appears to be the backseat. He was dealt some high-profile losses, like the striking down of his tariffs, but overall, Trump has had a very good year with this conservative majority court. Even in the decision to keep birthright citizenship, Justice Brett Kavanaugh provided a very clear roadmap for Congress to get it done and give the president exactly what he wants. And now we're asking the question, are there any checks and balances left? With that, let's get into the group chat. James Sample joins us, Hofstra Professor of Law, Molly Jong-Fast, MS Now political analyst and contributing opinion writer for The New York Times, former Democratic New York Congressman Max Rose, now a senior advisor to Vote Vets, and David Rhodes, MS Now senior national security reporter. All right, James, you brought the most notes. You came the most prepared, so you definitely get the first question. Where do we stand now in terms of separation of power? Because I would argue what I cover, finance, having three separate but equal branches of government is maybe one of the most important reasons why why investors invest their money here, why the foundation of American exceptionalism, the checks and balances.
And absolutely right. And you know markets way better than I do, but separation of powers equals stability, right? Where you see a lack of separation of powers, you get wild swings, you get erratic swings based on who's in office, right? Everyone loves a dictatorship when the dictator is benevolent. But you don't know that a dictator will always be a benevolent one, right? And so where we stand in terms of separation of powers after this Supreme Court term, Stephanie, is very clear. The executive branch has consolidated power. The unitary executive theory has been embraced by a significant portion of the Supreme Court. And the presidency, not just Donald Trump, but the presidency has a lot more power and a lot fewer checks than it has had in the past.
Molly is frantically writing down her favorite benevolent dictators. What's your take on checks and balances here?
I mean, this is the follow-up of the Reagan school, right? The unitary executive, the idea that a president has, it runs the show. Now, I do think it's interesting what they did with the Federal Reserve, right? There was the one place. They were like, everywhere the president is a sort of God king, except when it comes to the Fed.
And tariffs,
right,
which is also money.
Yeah, because the president's one guardrail, the markets and finances. That is it.
Look,
Congress willingly taking yet another back seat.
Yeah, Congress. Now Congress is really the domain for TikTok videos. And,
oh, my God.
But I think another question here is, do Democrats embrace this? Presidential race has already begun. Are the Democrats just going to be the party that says, let's go back to the good old days, return to normalcy, technocrats run the world? Or will some Democrats stand up and say, how are we going to use these new tools that we're aware of, particularly to hold accountable those who are engaged in just the most disgusting, overt corruption humanly imaginable?
So what should that look like?
Look, let's look at the FTC, okay? Next Democratic president can stand up and say any corporation that donated to the ballroom or other corporations that just stood with Trump and gave him millions of dollars, you're not going to get one merger, one acquisition approved. We don't care what the details of it look like. You were corrupt. You were overtly partisan. Game over for you for the remainder of our term.
David, take the war in Iran, for example. Congress took a long time to assert power, and then the Senate basically reversed course. Is Congress simply okay with giving up their power?
They appear to be, and I think these decisions and the passivity or divisions of Congress, all of this is opening the door to American authoritarianism. This is incredibly dangerous. He's the most powerful president in generations, maybe ever in the United States history. And bluntly speaking, he's making very bad policy decisions that have, ruined the economy. We've gone to a, war of choice in Iran. And it's extraordinary that this court, following this kind of ideological belief from the 80s, and that was that after Watergate, Congress asserted too much power. The presidency was weakened too much. But that happened because of criminal acts by Richard Nixon. We've now given more power to Donald Trump, who appears to be committing criminal acts. This is opening the door to American authoritarianism.
Some experts are concerned that Trump is going to use this power to interfere with the midterms. Do you share that fear?
1,000%.
As I asked it, I'm like, I know the answer to this question.
Here's the fight. In a post-January 6th world, this isn't like, oh, maybe he wants to. I don't. I don't know.
Yeah.
But so, like, we know that they're going to try to do something. They have the largest paramilitary force in ICE that a president has ever had. The question now is, what are we going to do about it? That's a particular question that we should pose to Democratic governors that actually this is where all the swing congressional races are. Virginia, New Jersey, New York, California, Michigan. That's where the game in town is. What are those Democratic governors doing? Where's their plan to say, here's how we're going to stand up to electoral interference?
And I also wonder about the Brennan Center, because there are all of these nonpartisan centers that are preparing the kind of legal challenges that may need to be put into action right away.
What about the High Court's decision on campaign finance, basically making it easier to put big money in campaigns, while Democrats that are winning are saying we're going to get all corporate money out of politics? It's a noble idea. It has a lot of support, but the court is saying the opposite, and it gives Republicans a real advantage heading into upcoming elections.
For sure. And by the way, like every decision this court has made in this cycle gives Republicans a big advantage. I mean, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and they come in before the primaries to make sure they can get enacted before the midterms. Like, it's looking very partisan here, team. But yeah, for sure. And I think, look, Democrats are right to run on these things. And what Max is talking about is important. There is a lot of anger towards incumbents, both on the left and the right. And we're seeing that in these primaries. They do not like business as usual. That is why Congress is so unpopular. And it goes to this idea of Congress giving away its power. People want both a Tea Party, I think, on the left and the right.
They want it, but it's the opposite of what we're getting. We're going to have more money in these elections than we've ever seen. New topic, birthright citizenship. What is your reaction to basically Justice Kavanaugh giving a roadmap to Congress?
Even if Congress takes the roadmap and tries to drive on that road, it is a road to nowhere. And the reason it's a road to nowhere is that if the constitutional holding has 5 votes, which it clearly does, Congress can pass all the statutes that they want. And first of all, they're not going to pass legislation that restricts birthright citizenship. That's not going to happen. But even if they did, the Constitution is supreme over a statute in the same way that the Constitution is supreme over an executive order, which is to say they can pass legislation as long as the 5 justices who are in the majority are still on the court. That legislation is unconstitutional for the same reason that yesterday's decision was reached.
Hofstra, they're not just good at playing lacrosse and teaching law. That's a little advertising for Hofstra. Well, because I'm hearing there's some Republicans. I mean, that was a good answer. Okay, it was a good answer. Some Republicans have already signaled they're going to take action, though. They like this idea.
Well, I don't know if you've noticed this, but sometimes politicians lie. And
you know there's some experience?
Never once. Well, you're tough today. What has been happening with the Republican Party for at least the last decade, if not longer, is that roughly 15-20% of their primary electorate super energized, super nativist, super racist. And what the Republicans have done is basically signal to them during campaigns, and then they've had folks like Stephen Miller do horrific, disgusting things administratively, and Congress has actually stayed away from immigration policy to date, other than this horrific ICE funding and enlargement. If they went in this direction, you would see a wholesale rejection from the majority of Americans who are just, I believe, and every piece of data points to this, don't want anything to do with a policy as nativist as this.
I mean, Congress has stayed away from almost everything, right? Especially
which is why incumbents are losing on both sides of the aisle.
For sure. And legislating is a good point. I mean, the idea that they would legislate birthright, they haven't legislated any restrictions on technology at all since Facebook. Like, this crew...
Since Facebook. When did they restrict anything on Facebook?
Right.
Since before Facebook.
Right. Yes. They have never legislated technology. And that's the thing. When you see all this money pouring into elections like crypto, they don't want regulation. You really need to spend that money. These people have not done anything.
It's just a broad sense that everything is fixed. Whether it's the private market and you make a killing in your stock options and nobody else gets anything, the election is fixed where all the money pours in for one side. And that will, I've had Republicans say this to me, that'll lead to radicalism on the left, a push for real change, and we'll see if, But that's what happened last night.
That's a good story. I mean, these journalists love to paint these narratives. Like
who won last night in the
These
Democratic
journalists love to paint these narratives. Did you live in New York City last week? Because I did.
Here's
I'm not saying violent radicalism. I'm saying pushing for big policy change.
I think what you are looking at ultimately is anti-establishment politics, which cannot and should not be confused with necessarily radical politics. Look at Adriana Espaillat. Adriana Espaillat was a consummate progressive, one of the first on board for impeaching Donald Trump, first on board for abolishing ICE. No one ever looked at him as a moderate, but he was an establishment figure that practiced kind of an establishment vibe of politics. So, I mean, it's a good storyline, but it's not what's happening.
People want change.
Yes, they want change. Before we go to break, of all the rulings that we saw, what do you think is going to have the most real-world impact?
The Slaughter case is the case that flies under the radar. It is the sleeping giant of the term because it's not sexy. We're talking about a case that, whether or not the president can fire the commissioners of independent agencies. And the court said, yes, the president can. To be clear, that's an overruling of a 90-year precedent. FDR wanted to fire the commissioner of the FTC that preceded him, that had been appointed by Coolidge. The court said no in a case called Humphrey's Executor. Donald Trump got what FDR did not.